Hey guys, Snoopy here today to talk about the map of arcs. Do a kind of short series on the map and the 12 setup cards that come with the game. So, the map of arcs is broken into 6 different clusters. So, these sectors or sections have 3 planets and a single gate. So, we're going to look at the gates first. So these gates are all identical. They're symmetrical in a sense, but they also have some uniqueness to them. So let's look at this gate in 1 here. So these planets, the weapons planet, the fuel planet, this material planet, are only accessible through this gate. So if I'm in the psionic planet, I cannot pass through. So that makes this gate more important. It can be blockaded. Who controls this gate? Is there someone controlling this gate? That's a relevant question if I need to get to this fuel planet, for example. Same thing applies to the gate in 4. So these planets are all protected by this single gate. They can't be accessed unless they go through the gate first. With this gate in 5 and 6, same thing with 2 and 3, the gate can also function that way if they're trying to catapult through a big movement, but a player can just slowly go from planet to planet and bypass this gate in 6 completely. So that's something to keep in note with these gates, is that while they look the same, functionally the gate in cluster 1 and the gate in cluster 4 function slightly different, and they're actually a little bit more important versus the other gates if you have cities or things you're trying to protect. Let's talk about the planets. So there are 18 planets on the map of arcs, and they're not evenly distributed. So we have 5 different types of planets here. So we have psionic at the bottom with just 3. Also, relic has 3 planets. Then we have material, fuel, and weapons with 4 each. And so we see psionic planet in cluster 6, cluster 5, and cluster 2 are the 3 there. And then relic would be cluster 5 as well, and then cluster 4 and cluster 2. Material would be in cluster 1, cluster 3, cluster 4, cluster 6. Weapons will be in 1, 2, 3, and 5. And then fuel is unique in that it's always in the middle if it's on the cluster. So fuel is in 1, 3, 4, and 6. So if you're going for a resource, it is important to note that there are more opportunities on fuel, material, and weapons than the other ones, like relic and psionic. Those are more rare just from a planet standpoint. Also worth noting is that if you're looking at the symbols for the campaign, fuel is taking 4 out of the 6 moon slots, versus the hexagon is going to be a variety of, you have material, relic, weapon, material again, psionic, and psionic. So half of the psionics on the map, or 2/3 of the psionics on the map, are hexagon. So just something to keep in mind here. Let's look at the building slots. So Arcs has 26 total building slots on the map itself. Now, when we go to setup cards, we're going to put markers to block off a complete cluster, perhaps 2 for just doing a 2 or 3 player game. But in the campaign, that's not happening. So we're just going to look at the base map and just understand how these building slots are laid out and if there's any rhyme or reason to them. So the first thing we can see is that there's either 1 slot or 2 slots on a planet. And if you count up the building slots for the arrow and the moon, they're each going to add up to 8. But this hexagon, if you add these up, it's actually going to add up to 10. So if you're just needing a quick rule of thumb, if you're looking for building slots, look at the hexagon symbol first. That's generally going to have 2 building slots. So we can just look at this one. So the material has 2, and the relic planet in 2 has 2 as well. And then in the weapon planet in 3, it has 2. In 4, it's just 1. In 5, we have 2 again. And then 6 is just 1. And so these 10 building slots on these hexagons does mean that there's a slight advantage to going for that area instead. Another thing to think about with building slots is which planets have the most building slots. So fuel and weapon vie for the most available building slots with 6 each. So those 2 planets together combine for almost half of all the building slots on the map. Relic material each have 5 building slots. And psionic has the least, with just 4 building slots on the map. So 1 in 6, 1 in 2, and 2 on this planet in 5. So this means psionic is the hardest resource potentially to get in a game of arcs, particularly if this 5th cluster is blockaded in the setup. Then you only have 2 building slots on 2 different planets. Finally, in arcs, let's talk about clusters. So the clusters in arcs, the things to keep in mind are what planets are in the cluster and how many total building slots am I dealing with here. So we can look at this first cluster. We have 5 building slots, but in 2, we only have 4. And so the average is actually 4, except for 1 and 4. So remember how I said that the gates 1 and 4 were harder to get to because of these rifts, these barriers that you can't pass through from planet to planet? Well, these 2 clusters have the most building slots on the map. So that's another reason why these gates matters, because these gates are protecting the most building slots per cluster in 4 and in 1. Another thing to note is that for pairing, the only pair of a relic planet next to a psionic planet is in cluster 5. And because this psionic planet has 2 building slots, you could do a city and a starport, a city here, and start taxing and building up your fleet. You even could do another material city here to start getting more material so you can keep pumping out ships when you tax. There is no other place on the map that's easy to do this besides perhaps cluster 2, but this relic planet is not next to psionic planet, but that's something you could also try to do in cluster 2. But really, these 2 planets right here, that's the best way to go for psionic and relics very easily in cluster 5. For fuel and material, we actually have 4 pairs here. So we see it first in cluster 1, we see it in cluster 3, we see it in cluster 4, we have it in cluster 6. For fuel and weapons, we see this in cluster 1, we see in cluster 3. And so there are perhaps other things to keep in mind too with pairing, but in general, fuel and material and fuel and weapons, and then psionic and relic are what you're keeping in mind as far as adjacent places where I could build a starport, build a city, or just build 2 cities and just get a good resource combo going just with a 2 tax action. And the last thing I want to note here, this is more related to the planets, but we have 8 planets here that are next to these rifts where you can't pass through. And so these make them more isolated. So the only way to access this psionic planet in 6, and the same thing with this weapon planet in 1, is through either the gate or it's one planet next door. And so these more restricted planets actually even out to be more for weapons. So we have 1 weapon planet here, 1 weapon planet here, another one here. So out of the 8, 3 are weapon planets. And then 2 are psionic planets, and 2 are material planets. And then the last one is this 1 relic planet here. So if you're going for these, keep in mind that this is harder to perhaps get out of particularly if you're going for weapons. But it also means that it's harder to get to because people can't just go from one planet in this cluster over. They have to go through the gate, or they have to go through this fuel planet to get to your weapon planet, for example. All right, I hope this was fun and helpful. The next video will be covering the different setup cards. So we'll just do it at the different player counts of 4, then 3, then 2. See you next time.